Hey everyone, this is the second part of my two-part tutorial on chord symbols. Now if you haven't seen the first part, I'll include a link to it in the description text underneath this one, because you should probably go and check that out before you watch this. Now just to recap where we got to at the end of the first tutorial, in that previous tutorial we looked at some of the more kind of common chord symbols you'll come across and their variants and some of the sources of confusion that you might experience when you're using them. Today we're going to look at more complex and exotic chords, starting off with some chords that are relatively unusual but which you'll still see pretty often, and then finishing up with some of the really wild and woolly things that you might occasionally see or hear about. I should say that this tutorial, like the last one, isn't intended to be completely comprehensive. There's no chance that we could cover every single chord symbol and every single variant of every chord symbol because there are just too many. But hopefully we'll deal with most of the stuff that you'll actually come across on a day-to-day basis as you work through songbooks and lead sheets. So let's start today with something relatively vanilla, slash chords. I've made a whole tutorial on slash chords in the past and I'll include a link to it below. But basically if you see something like this, or slightly more controversially like this, it means play a particular chord with a particular note in the bass. And usually the intention is to specify an inversion of the chord, or maybe there's some chord substitution going on where the bass note is important for the chord function or whatever. Let's look at a couple of examples. So G/B is a G major chord with a B in the bass. Okay, so G/B. A-7 over G is an A-7 chord with a G in the bass, or a G as the lowest bass note. So you might have other chord notes in the left, but the important thing is that the G there is the lowest bass note. Now I would say it doesn't matter whether the slash is horizontal, like a fraction, or oblique, okay? I had a view on a comment thread on a tutorial the other week arguing that horizontal lines should only be used for polychords, okay, and that oblique lines should only be used for slash chords, and they're very different things. I'll talk about what polychords actually are shortly. Now, looking around, it looks like some people do it that way, okay? So horizontal line, polychord, oblique line, slash chord. But that strikes me as sort of awkward, especially if you're writing out chords online. So what I would say is that if you ever see anything like either of these ways of doing it, okay, assume it's a slash chord. Unless you get some sort of indication otherwise, some sort of indication that it's a polychord. We'll talk about what that might be in a minute, and I'll suggest what I think is a good way around the slash chord, polychord ambiguity. As I say, more on that in a few minutes. Next up, and again relatively common, are add and sus chords. Now in part one we briefly mentioned the word omit as it turns up in chord symbols. So let's start off by having a look at its opposite, add, which is quite a lot more common. Add most often turns up in the add 9 chord. Okay, so here is C add 9 notated, almost always notated like that, sometimes with brackets, sometimes without. It doesn't make any difference. And all that symbol means, as you probably know, is play a regular C chord and add the 9th, which is a D. Okay, now there are a couple of complications because sometimes people are a bit lazy with add 9 chords, and I include myself in that, yeah? Strictly speaking, an add 9 chord also, in addition to the 9th, includes all of the notes of the original chord. So we have C, E, G, add 9. Okay, so that makes it different from a sus2 chord. We'll come on to sus chords in a second. Very often, it also implies that the D will be next to the C and the E. Okay, if you had something like that, then yes, strictly speaking, that's an add 9 chord, but usually in most contexts that you'll come across, that will be notated as a major 9, or just as a C9, usually. To my mind, add 9 means you're adding the 9 right next to the E, or right next to the C, or even between both. Often you'll see them voiced something like that, with the C in the bass, then the 9th, E and G. Yeah? Sometimes you will see them notated even as C9 if people are being really lazy, although clearly that's actually wrong. I'm guilty of it myself, but it is actually wrong because strictly speaking, C9 has the B flat in there. Now if you see a chord symbol like this, C sus, or C sus4, or C sus2, whether or not you've got brackets, yeah, doesn't make any difference, then you're dealing with a sus chord. Sus stands for suspended, and what it basically means, as you may know, is that you've got a basic major triad like C major, and instead of the third note, yeah, of the root position chord, the E, you're playing the second note, the D, or the fourth note. Yeah, and the important thing is that the middle note, the E, is missing and is replaced with the second or the fourth. So C sus2, C sus4, and that makes them very different from add chords. Okay, as we saw with C add 9, you've got all the notes of the original chord plus a ninth, but in C sus2, that E is missing. So strictly speaking, it's a different chord, though people do often, get a bit lazy with the different forms of notation. Okay, if you see something just called C sus, it means C sus4. Okay, if it's a sus2, that should always be specified. Now sometimes you'll get people doing weird stuff with sus chords, like adding sevenths and ninths. Okay, so C sus7, okay, or let's think of another one you might have, F9 sus, yeah. Sometimes that's a valid way of notating a chord, but if you're ever kind of tempted to use that kind of sus chord notation, do be aware that often there's a clearer way of writing the chord, okay? So if you've got F sus9 or F9 sus, you see both. That is the supposed F9 sus chord. Why not make it a slash chord and just call it C minus 7 over F? To my mind, that's clearer, more logical. It doesn't have people scratching their heads trying to work out what you mean. Now let's move on and have a look at some of the more exotic chord symbols that you might come across. Most of these are pretty rare in the context of pop music, but if you're playing jazz, if you've got a specialised jazz songbook or fake book or whatever, then you will see quite a few of these chords. Now the first category of these more complex chords that we need to mention are those that have flattened and sharpened extensions, and the generic name for these chords is altered chords, although we need to be a little bit careful with that terminology, as we'll see in a minute. So for example, you might come across something like C7 flat 9. That means play a C7 chord plus a flattened ninth. The ninth is D, and if we flatten it, that gives us D flat. Okay. Now something to watch out for there, that D flat is a semitone away from C, the root note of the chord, so unless you want a really noticeable clash, and you might want that, but most often you won't, make sure you separate the two by an octave, yeah? And if you see a chord notated C7 flat 9, it is usually expected that you'll keep those two clashing tones apart. Okay, remember, if you see that chord symbol as well, don't miss out the root note of the chord. Yeah, if you've got C7 sharp ninth and you miss out the root, it just becomes a C sharp diminished seventh. Yeah, it changes the identity and probably the function of the chord. Another common and very similar one is the sharp ninth. Okay, so there's C7. And there's C7 sharp 9. We've taken the ninth and taken it up a semitone, a half step. Again, similar sort of principle. And again, we've got that sharp ninth, the D sharp and the E in the same chord. If you see that chord symbol, usually it would be expected that you would keep those two apart. If you didn't, it's a really very dramatic effect. Yeah? As I say, the general term for that kind of chord is altered chords, yeah, and often you will see alterations on the 5th, on the 9th, on the 13th, less often on the 11th, because that's the same as the 4th. Okay, and flattening the 11th would just give you the regular third of the chord, and sharpening the 11th would give you a flat 5th. You can notate those things in other ways, but especially on the 5th, the 9th and the 13th degrees of the chord, and they're pretty easy to read. They are usually notated in that very straightforward way, name of the chord, and then after it listed the various alterations. So those are altered chords in a general sense. But if you move in the murky world of jazz, you'll often hear people talking about the altered chord or the altered dominant, which is usually written something like this, G7 alt for an altered G7 chord. Now that symbol is really just used as a catch-all to refer to all altered chords based on that particular 7th chord, based on the G7. And it's usually taken to mean a 7th chord that also features a 5th, and a 9th and maybe a 13th that have been sharpened or flattened in some way, possibly also with the unaltered versions of that tone in the same chord. Okay, so if you just write the general symbol for the alt chord in a progression, G7 alt, players will usually feel at liberty to muck around with that chord as they see fit. Okay, some people see that differently. You will come across people saying, oh no, G7 alt means a G7 with a a sharp 9th and a flat 5th or whatever, but so many people see it in different ways that the safest way to treat that notation is as not quite as a free-for-all, but as a general indication that people should alter that chord in some way. If you really want a specific combination of flattened or sharpened 5ths, 9ths, 13ths or whatever in a particular chord, it's better to specify exactly what you mean rather than just write G7 alt. And as we saw in part 1 of this two-part tutorial, the more complex a chord is and the more precisely you want it to be played, the more you should consider moving away from chord notation and towards writing the thing out in full score. Another type of chord that's quite common in jazz is the minor major 7th. Okay, there is C minor major 7th. If you like a bit of theory, this is quite an interesting one because it's actually diatonic. It's naturally occurring on the tonic note of a harmonic minor scale. Yeah, so there is C harmonic minor, there's the tonic note, build up your chord in thirds, and there is C minor major 7th. It's quite a nice chord. Crops up reasonably often in jazz, but otherwise it's not that common. The reason I'm mentioning it is that it's the one chord that I can think of that seems to get written in more different ways than any other. Yeah. At the time of making this tutorial, the Wikipedia page for the minor major 7th chord lists 10 different ways of writing it, and some are fine, but others aren't. Okay, others are quite unclear, especially the ones using minus signs. If you remember the first part of this tutorial, you'll remember that I'm quite down on using the minus sign to indicate a minor chord. Okay, now generally I think the clearest way of notating that chord, if you ever have to, is as CM brackets parentheses major 7th, C minor with a major 7. That spells out what the chord does. It's nice and clear. But just think about the sheer number of different ways people use to write that chord. There's a general rule to draw from that. The more exotic, the more unusual and the more complex chords get, the more you'll find that people have varied and idiosyncratic ways of writing them down. There isn't one right way of doing it, but as ever, the golden rule is if you're writing your chords for other people to read, then you should be as clear and unambiguous as possible. Another odd one is the 6-9 chord, which you'll also see notated in various ways. If you don't know the 6-9, it's a straightforward triad, major or minor, plus the 6, plus the 9th, but with no 7th, okay? So C, 6-9, C minor, 6-9. Since we're dealing with the weird and wonderful, let's go back to polychords, which I mentioned earlier. A polychord is basically 2 or sometimes even more chords that are played at the same time, like G and C. If something is described as a polychord, it usually implies something about the order that the notes are played in. So for example, the notes in this polychord are just the same as the notes of the chord C major 9, C, E, G, B and D. But the fact that we're playing all the notes of the G chord here and all of the notes of the C chord here means it can make more sense to think of it and call it a polychord, one chord stacked on top of another. Now the way that polychord fans and theorists like to notate these things is like this, as if it's a fraction. But we've already mentioned the problem with that. It's easy to confuse with a slash chord, not least because many writers and publishers, including me, sometimes notate slash chords like that, as if it's a fraction, yeah? Also, it's kind of hard to write online. It strikes me that the smart thing to do here is to notate it like this, as C maj over G maj, using either the fraction notation or the slash notation. Yeah, I'm not, it's not my idea, other people have done that before me, but I think that's the best way of doing it. Yeah, that way it's clear that the things either side of the line are both chords and not single notes. Okay, if you're interested in polychords, if you want to find out more about the thinking behind that kind of notation, there is, as there often is, a fairly detailed debate about polychord notation on Our Music Theory on Reddit. Yeah, just Google polychords Reddit and you're sure to find it. Okay, we're nearly done, and we're now out in the real wild west of chord notation, the point at which chord notation begins to break. And that's because I'm now going to be talking about a category of chords called stacked interval chords. Now, if you know a little bit about music theory, you might think that that terminology doesn't make much sense at first, because as you probably know, all chords are made up of intervals stacked on top of one another. Okay, so there's C major, and that's a third, with another third stacked on top of it. C major 7 is another third stacked on top of that. But most chords that we're familiar with use thirds in their stack, yeah, at least in their root position. Once you start inverting a chord, fourths and so on appear, but in their root position, the position in which we generate the chord in a theoretical way, we're looking at a stack of thirds. Stacked interval chords, or interval stacks as they're sometimes called, simply use intervals other than thirds, and in principle those intervals can be anything. You can have alternating seconds and thirds, you can have 2/3 and 2/4 or whatever, but the most common interval stacks are chords that are built up of stacked fourths, so-called quartal chords, and stacked fifths, so-called quintal chords. Again, as with polychords, if something is considered a quartal or quintal, for example, it often says something about the order of the notes, because many stacked interval chords can also be described in other ways. So the quartal, built on A, D, G, C, you could call that D minor 7 sus. Okay, so it's like a D minor 7 chord with a sus4, and it's just exactly those notes, D, G, A and C. Okay, but the fact it's thought of as a quartal suggests, rather than as an altered D minor 7, suggests that it's something more like in that order with the A at the bottom. Okay, it's a clearer representation of the stacked interval. Now, I'm talking about stacked interval chords, quartals, quintals, all the rest of them, because they are a really good example of the point at which chord notation really fails. Yeah, how do we notate these things? There just isn't anything remotely like an agreed way of doing it. If you Google around, some people seem to take the kind of approach that you should find the nearest stacked third chord that's similar, or altered stacked third chord, like that D minor 7 sus we just looked at. And then other people have their own system. So quite a nice one I've come across is Q4 for a quartal chord and Q5 for a quintal chord. So that would be CQ4 and that would be CQ5. Okay, quintal rooted on C. I quite like that, and in fact I've over the past year or two I've started using it a little bit if I'm jotting down chords in a hurry, but most people would not know what it is. It has nothing like wide acceptance. So as I've said before, and I just want to ram this point home one more time, if you're getting to the point where your chord notation is beginning to look like algebra because you're trying to specify so much information about voicings of individual chords and the notes and the intervals within those chords, you need to accept that you've pushed chord notation past its limits. And a lot of people will hate me saying this, but in those circumstances you need to reach for this stuff, okay, good old manuscript paper, and score out your chords. It is just way more efficient than trying to push chord notation past the point at which it really works. Okay, so there we go. I hope that has answered some of your questions about chord notation and cleared up some of the more common problems that you will come across. Big thanks to Chris for asking the original question which kind of inspired these two tutorials. Again, I'll include a link to Chris's YouTube channel in the description text underneath this tutorial, because as I said in the first tutorial, he's a really interesting guy, makes some great instruments, makes some great music, so do go and check out his stuff. As usual, I'll round up by saying if you're not subscribed to the channel, just hit the red button in the bottom right hand corner there. Please do follow me on Facebook, on Twitter and on Instagram. All the links you need are below. Check out my Patreon crowdfunder if you can spare a few dollars a month just to support what I'm doing here on patreon.com/Bill Hilton. And check out my books, last of all, especially How to Really Play the Piano, the Stuff Your Teacher Never Taught You, which, if you can read just a little bit of sheet music, will really help you develop your understanding of chord symbols, chord notation, improvisation, harmony, all of that kind of stuff. Okay, keep the questions coming because they are so useful. They are such a great source of tutorial material, and I'll see you again soon.